Hello everyone, this is Mr. Owen. We are about to begin a boat tour down the Nile River, where we're going to explore the various ways that the Nile influenced ancient Egypt and how much of their culture was based around it. This is going to prepare us to tour through some of the more famous Egyptian monuments and their history throughout the many, many centuries that was ancient Egypt. So let's get started.
Welcome to Bringer of Life, the River Nile.
So as you see, this is an Egyptian sailing ship. You see the various items on board, and it is both powered by me steering with the oar here, and as well as sails.
The ancient Egyptians called the dark fertile soil of the Nile the Black Lands, and the surrounding desert was referred to as the Red Lands. The dramatic difference of productive land opposed to barren desert had a deep influence on cultural ideology, mythology, and religion.
So, sort of a review of the ideas we've already covered in class. As we navigate down the river, I want you to pay close attention not only to the landscape around, but also the other ships on the water and kind of seeing what they are up to and their activities throughout the travel, as well as pay attention to what is in the water, because there's going to be a lot of floating debris representative of all the flooding and the stuff that the Nile picks up in its long journey to the sea. And there may be some other interesting things in the water that we can talk about as we pass through. But right now we're just passing another one of these kind of smaller fishing vessels like the one I am on right now.
The Nile determined much of Egyptian civilization. For example, the seasonal cycle of the Nile was so consistent that ancient Egyptians created their calendar around it. The flood season, or Akhet, was when the departing floodwaters left arable soil for crops. It was followed by the growing and harvesting seasons, known as Peret and Shemu. These regular seasons, along with abundant wildlife and rich soil, meant that Egypt's denizens were able to nourish themselves and ensure their country's strength in trade.
Once more, back to those concepts that everything in Egypt was based around the Nile, including their seasons and the trade that they would get from exchanging items. So you see a lot of things in the water like palm fronds and other bits of plant life, probably just ripped out as the floodwaters go by. You see here a few floating pieces of pottery, likely maybe just picked up or they got away from some individuals and are now just floating in the river with us as we head up to our next station.
The River Nile, flowing from the south to the north, neatly traversed through both Upper and Lower Egypt. All of Egypt's major cities were built along this narrow ribbon of life. Protected by mountain ranges and deserts which acted as natural barriers to enemies, and sustained by the Nile's plants and wildlife, Egyptian civilization enjoyed economic and cultural prosperity for over 4,000 years.
So 4,000 years is quite a long period. Most European countries can only trace their actual history from the fall of Rome about 1,200 years or so. U.S. being only about 250 years old. So 4,000 years is a long period of history for one location, one empire. So we have to keep that in mind as we go through Egypt, but just how ancient and long-lived it is compared to modern countries even today.
Both ancient Egyptians and ancient Greeks referred to the Nile as the river in their respective languages. Stretching a distance of over 6,700 kilometers, the Nile is one of the longest rivers in the world. It flows south to north, spanning 11 countries. The River Nile originates in the region of the Great Subequatorial Lakes, including one of the largest in the world, Lake Victoria near Tanzania.
So you can see here in this NASA satellite picture, the greenery of the river. That it's only through those areas that the river flows that you can actually see life growing. The rest is desert. We continue to navigate through the river. For any of you that have driven a boat before, they are not quite like driving a car. A little more back and forth action to them. I'm going to try to avoid running into other boaters, as that would not be good for our continued tour. Of course, they want to stop right in my path. How considerate. This large ship here, you notice, traveling through, seems to be hauling some lumber, likely from a neighboring kingdom, because there's not much in the way of lumber production here in Egypt. Still watching the waters, mostly just seeing floating debris. But we'll get a chance to hopefully see some wildlife as we keep trekking downriver. And we are heading towards the Delta and the Mediterranean, so we are going with the current.
The river flows through African equatorial forests, swamps, volcanic lands, steppes, and deserts, splitting apart for a while and picking up various sediments from each region and carrying them all the way to Egypt. Its main artery, known as the White Nile, rejoins with the Blue Nile in Khartoum. This is where it weaves through rich deposits of silt and nutrients, carrying them along in its wake.
So the Nile on its long journey passes through many different regions and picks up bits of soil and nutrients from those regions that all get churned and mixed up together like a giant blender as the water travels northward towards the ocean. And so it takes all that variety and deposits it on the shores of the Nile whenever it floods each year. And so that's how it continues to replenish the nutrients in the soil from season to season. We're going to go off the side for a second. First, because I see something in the water. I'm not going to get too close, though. That is a Nile crocodile. So even in antiquity, they had to deal with dangerous wildlife, and crocodiles were very common in the waters of the Nile. I'm not going to try to upset him too much. I'm going to go around him, but he is a big old boy. Here you can see some ruins that have been reclaimed by the Nile. Because if you think 4,000 years old, the setting of this game is the Ptolemaic era of Egypt, which is much, much later in its history, or more close to our current time. So thousands of years, ruins become very dated, and maybe people don't even know what they were used or purposed for, because it's been 2,000 years since the people that put it there were alive.
The Nile crosses 6 cataracts from the south to the north, creating natural obstacles between the various sections of the river. The cataracts are long zones of about 100 kilometers, where the bubbling and rapidly swirling waters advance tumultuously amid enormous heaps of rocks and benches of hard stone.
So cataract is similar to what we think of as rapids. So if anyone that's been white water rafting, that's a similar type thing. And so as it goes through those areas, we're talking about the mixing of all the soils and the nutrients, but it also provides a dangerous area to navigate through. As anyone that's been whitewater rafting would know, you wouldn't want to take a wooden ship through that, or else you'd probably likely see it destroyed very quickly. Speaking of destroying ships, as we come up here on the left, I want you to take a look at this larger ship, and notice its design. This is actually a Greek ship. As we've talked about before, Egypt lasted through to the times of the Greeks and the Romans and traded with them. And so this ship here is called a Greek trireme. And this was the battleship of the ancient world. long before they had cannons and missiles and like all the stuff we think of for more recent or modern battleships. They had these, and so without any gunpowder, the biggest weapon on it is what you can see at the front, is that ram just next to the edge of the water. And they would literally sail these ships at each other and try to punch a hole in the side of the other ship in order to get it to start sinking. But also, as they punched a hole in, soldiers could jump from the top of it there onto the other ship and fight in hand-to-hand combat. So one of the things we're going to talk about more when we get to Greece and Rome is the trireme.
It is after crossing Nubia and the First Cataract that the river officially returns to Egypt in Aswan. There are still 1,000 kilometers before it reaches Cairo and the Delta, bringing life to those living on its shores before it eventually empties into the Mediterranean Sea.
So once it passes the cataracts and gets into Egypt, it still has a long way to go for what is Egypt before it heads to the Delta, which is where we're navigating towards right now, is the Nile Delta. And the river's gonna split into multiple smaller tributaries as it empties out into the Mediterranean, creating a very lush and fertile area within the delta. And you're gonna see that reflected here as we navigate downriver. I'm still keeping my eye on the river for other things. We've seen a Nile crocodile. Maybe we can see some other bits of wildlife as well. Oh, but here, speaking of sinking ships, here is one, the remains of a ship that has sunk into the waters. You can see the mast there and the front, or the bow of it. So when a ship would sink, they really didn't have a good, easy way to pull it out of the water. Not to mention, there's crocodiles in there. You don't want to go swimming down trying to pull out a ship with wildlife in there. So they just have to let it sit and deteriorate, and hopefully the seasonal flooding would eventually wear it away, and it would no longer be a hazard in the water as people were traversing through.
Ancient Egyptian irrigation and water use was centered around the Nile. However, they also had access to streams and rivers, as well as several large lakes. The delta, situated at the north end of the Nile, also known as Lower Egypt, is a large irrigated area where the river splits into several tributaries.
So you can see this splitting right here as it now becomes a large kind of cone-shaped green region, and that's where we're heading into on our boat right now, is to the Nile Delta. And hopefully, as we do that, we're able to spot the last bits of wildlife. I'm going to try to beat this ship here. Close one. Now, as we start heading into the Nile Delta, we will see an abundance of wildlife, because as the river splits and becomes more greenery, it's more room for creatures to start making their homes. You see a lot of birds, and like a swan there, possibly a crane making its home here in the delta. Notice that the water's gotten much shallower and the colors change. It's much lighter green. That is not only because of the mix of the soil and the greenery around it, but also darker water usually means deeper water, typically.
The delta had several major brackish coastal lakes, bodies of water separated from the sea by thin strips of land. A mix of deep to shallow waters, salt swamps, and sand plains, these lakes were refuge to a wealth of species, as well as water and land plants. The occasional bandit could also be found sheltering within the denser reeds, waiting for the unwary traveler.
So even then they had, bandits or river pirates, I guess you'd call them, that would be waiting to ambush any trade vessels or fishermen coming through. Let's go ahead and take a aerial view. We can see a few things a little more close. You see a family of crocodiles right there, just sunning themselves in the mud as we navigate the tributary here. There's more crocodiles there on the edges of the water. That one's heading in. Plenty of birds within. And you see multiple vessels. Fishing, traveling. Some might be trading. And then the multiple settlements throughout. We'll get a higher view here in a second. I'm trying to find one of the things that we're not seen before. Oh, there we go. As we go overhead, that is a hippopotamus, which is also a very common form of wildlife in the Nile. Even today, hippopotamus are considered very dangerous creatures. They might look like cute and innocent, but they can be very territorial and aggressive, and can be one of the more deadly creatures within Africa. Right next to like the lions and other carnivorous creatures. Alright, we'll go ahead and get a little higher view here. Oh, I see some deer down there grazing. And so as we get further up, you can see the Nile splitting into multiple small tributaries as it fans out into the delta, and all the various settlements throughout utilizing this waterway as it begins to empty into the Mediterranean Sea. I want to thank you all for taking part in this tour today. We are going to be moving on to talking about some of the more famous Egyptian monuments, starting with the one right over there, the Great Pyramid of Giza. Hope you guys have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next time.